Well, I thought I'd talk about the government shutdown that's occurring. I don't think that it's that big of a deal. Obviously, the government is not shutting down in a very meaningful sense. It is curtailed in some very minor degree that is, I'd say, mostly negligible, except for it's rhetorically kind of nice. Um, it's interesting how if this does result in any reduction in spending, that we'd be talking about a government that's still spending as much as it was, like, I don't know, a couple months ago. And I don't see how that's such a huge deal. I don't think that it's significant in the sense that it shows a really strong um, libertarian or minarchist strain within the Congress. I think you have a couple congressmen who are genuinely ideologically or strongly against some of the policies of the president, which they should be. Everyone should be against almost all the policies of the president. But I think that's only a minority. Most of them, I think, are just engaging in a little political grandstanding. I don't think it indicates any actual distrust of big government or Obama generally, but I think that just the nature of the political dynamics of the electoral process kind of puts them in a position where they have to do it. Now it's kind of a question of who's going to blink first, and I really don't care. I think it's not that big of a deal one way or another. It is also interesting how, a couple weeks ago they're talking about a war in Syria. This is one of the memes that's going around there, so I don't claim to have been originally come up with this notion, but they have a war in Syria that would cost many many billions of dollars, and now they can't keep national parks open, and the the means the way they select what they're going to shut down is so obviously designed towards pulling political levers. They want to shut down things that's going to piss people off, and not things that are actually extraneous. They're not going to shut down anything that is important to their power. Nothing. They're not going to shut down the NSA. They're not going to shut down key military installations. They're not going to shut down the police. They're not going to close the prisons. They're not going to release nonviolent offenders. They're not going to stop paying themselves. They're going to pull on people's heartstrings. And now for all the government employees out there, and I don't think it's come to this yet, and I doubt that it will, but in the event that it does, if you're some kind of government pensioner, I really don't have a ton of sympathy for you, because the government is a capricious bastard to have as a boss. Uh, it ruins everybody's life, even if we purposely try and disassociate with it. And if you have it be your employer, the source of your income, then you are just waiting for it to screw you. And it may never do it. I mean, it may never have a reason to. There are plenty of people who live their entire lives on a government salary and were never screwed. But that's not because the government's benevolent or not because the government won't do so. It's just that the circumstances never arose where it decided to do that. If you place yourself in that position, I'm sorry, you made a mistake. I can understand most people don't see the government in those terms, but it's not exactly a secret. I mean, even George Washington said that it was, quote unquote, a fearful master. Um, and given that he was the first president, I think he's allowed to have an opinion on the matter. Um, so there's that. But one thing I thought was interesting about the whole thing is a lot of people. Well, there's a couple interesting things. One is I see a lot of liberals out there just like, look, you can't oppose Obamacare because it's a law of the land. It was passed, it was signed, and it was and they have this very very legalistic, absolute like moral. They sound exactly like every Bible thumping, high and mighty socially conservative Republican out there that you've ever met. When they're talking about this law, as if it's not the role of legislatures to question legislation or to have any say. It's like it's not their role as legislators to pass bills about finance, when that's exactly what they're supposed to do. Uh, but it was just ironic because the people I saw posting things along the line of, hey, this is because I think Jon Stewart made a video about this as well, although I didn't watch it. And it's like, do these people then never smoke pot? Are these people entirely in favor of the drug war? Are they entirely in favor of the Patriot Act or the FISA courts or the NDAA or all these other things that so many people, including the vast majority of liberals, condemn in no uncertain terms? All those things are laws of the land as well. They're all duly passed. Everything that Bush signed, that's the law of the land. Everything that Dick, like the idea that the legislation that you don't like, uh, you flaunt and criticize, and the legislation that you do like, all high and mighty, you can't, you know, that's kind of, but that's kind of shows their hypocrisy and their partisan nature, that they can't see past, you know, that. And with Obamacare, it's particularly glaring because I never met a liberal before who advocated anything even close to Obamacare. It gets passed. It's a huge subsidy for the insurance companies. The insurance companies that are usually depicted as evil, blood-sucking vampires who do nothing. Like the only reason insurance companies exist is to deny claims, to take people's money and then decline paying out to them, and essentially is culpable in their murders. So a bill designed to force everyone to be their customers is now what all the liberals are for. I don't know. But the main thing I think is interesting is the idea that we shouldn't allow this to happen because it messes with the quote-unquote full faith and credit of the United States government. That it's wrong for there to be any kind of question about raising the debt ceiling or passing a budget or enforcing this or that law, because even if even if there's some argument to be made against the efficacy of, say, Obamacare or some other law, it's too dangerous and it's unwarranted, and it's just wrong to do anything that is going to question the full faith and credit or the legitimacy of the government. And the problem with that argument is that it's based on the assumption that the government deserves people's faith. And I don't think it's intentional, but I think it's also significant that included in there is the admission or the characterization of belief in government as faith, which indeed it is. And indeed people have faith in the government. That's the government's bread and butter. That's how it exists. It doesn't exist through direct coercion on everybody. It does coercion on the margins. There's the threat of coercion, but most people believe in it to some extent. Either they positively think it's good, or they think it's a necessary evil, or they think it's pragmatically something that just is going to have to exist, the same way they accept snowstorms or death or pestilence or whatever. And in that sense, I think it's telling that people couch it in those terms. But the assertion that it deserves our faith and credit, I think, is utterly ridiculous. There is no reason to assume that the government deserves our faith or anything of the kind. And it's hardly because of this latest incident. It's because of its entire history. The assertion that its claims to be needed and to be worthwhile are all extremely dubious. They rest on essentially its own say-so, and a correlation does not equal causation fallacy. People like to look around the world and say, look, things are relatively good, our lives are relatively decent, the government exists, hence the government is to be accredited with at least a large part, or at least some part, of our well-being. The problem with that argument is, well, there's a couple. One is that it doesn't take into account that there's a cost. It's not like government is just this magic wellspring of additional resources, additional services and goods that just materialize out of the ether of the universe. That is, all of it is the result of a redistribution of resources, of rights, of power, of political prerogatives. And for everything that it does, there is a cost. And unless you're going to compare the two, you're not making any kind of utilitarian argument at all for its efficacy. You're just saying, you have to just ignore the costs and say, I'm not factoring them in. The fact that we have to give it all this tax money, that we have to surrender so much of our prerogatives to submit to its regulations and its laws and all that, If you're not going to consider that, then you're not making any kind of honest attempt to actually look at the two. The other problem is that uh, there's a correlation causation fallacy. Yes, the government exists. That's true. And so it's then alleged, so hence all this stuff, everything good is the result of government. But many things exist. In fact, everything that exists exists. And so we could just as easily assert that anything that exists is responsible, is the magical linchpin of society that makes everything good. And there are actually other plausible institutions that make this claim, specifically religions. Many of the religions, and I would say probably most of them, argue at least at some point, at some time, that the moral code that they put forward, their theology, their covenant with God, I mean, they have it on different levels. They might say it's because of God's direct intervention, because of the proper worship of Him, or because of the utilitarian effects that their ideology and theology has in society, make the claim that our society owes its prosperity to them. There's plenty of Christians who say, look, the ideological success of the West is rooted in Judeo-Christianity. And we can debate that, but we can't debate that it's true that there's Judeo-Christianity influence in Western countries, especially in the United States. And so, and I've heard religious leaders explicitly assert this, and they're right in the sense that those religions do exist without question as formalized institutions and as um, potent political thoughts, potent social, not political, potent social thoughts. And so their assertion, uh, to being the linchpin that makes society good is no different than the government's. And we could go on. I mean, the Boy Scouts could say this, the Mafia could say this, um, any number of businesses could say this. In fact, it's quite common for people in this or that career to assert that their career is absolutely vital to society. So farmers are going to say, if it wasn't for us, nothing. So farmers, hence civilization. But then you're going to have chemists who are going to say that. You're going to have teachers who say that, whether they public or private. You're going to have the Teamsters who are going to say that. Everybody's going to say that, and everybody does say that. Now, the only added evidence is that the government doesn't just exist, it also asserts that the reason it exists is to benefit society. But that's just an assertion. It hasn't proven that. And if you really look at their actions, it's very clear that they pursue their own narrow self-interests. Again, looking at the budget cuts that they do, where they reduce money, it's not stuff that's going to hurt them, it's stuff that's going to hurt other people, that's going to generate political points for them. It's not there. There's as much as I don't like the notion of Benthamite most good for the most people. It's very hard to see how government action even begins to approximate any attempt to do the most good for the most people. It is very clear that government action is geared towards the benefit of the government or its favorites. And the only way you can conclude otherwise is simply accept that whatever the government says is true, or the syllogism that whatever the government does automatically counts is what's best for society. And I've had very lengthy debates with people online to eventually, sort hey, if society allows something to exist, then whatever it does is the manifestation of society's will. And so whatever the government does is the manifestation of society's will. Of course, this argument proves everything then. Anything that happens in society was allowed to occur by society and hence carries the mandate of society. So my, staying in bed is the mandate of society. My being an anarchist is the mandate of society. If I were to go out and commit heinous murders, that would be the value of society. And if whatever the government does, no matter what, also would fall into that category. It proves everything and nothing at the same time. The others is to just accept that whatever the government asserts is that it's, as long as the government says that what it is doing is for everyone's common good, then that's good enough. And I think that's just silly. And I think people can kind of recognize this when they look at other governments. Again, all of you know that I'm a very big history buff, and I was just watching a documentary about the Hittites. There's a good, if you go on YouTube, it's a 2 hour long documentary, and it's by far the best that I've seen about the Hittite Empire because it's about 2 hours long. It's narrated by Jeremy Irons, so if you type Hittite Empire Jeremy Irons, you'll find it. But there's a part where they're talking about the Battle of Kadesh, and the Battle of Kadesh is famous because it's the first battle in history that we have that's historical, that we have documentation about its course, what happened. Obviously, there were battles before this, but we don't have any details about them, even when and where they occurred. This is a battle that we have details from both sides. We have the Egyptian side of the events and the Hittite side of the events. And when you read the Egyptian descriptions of this battle, it's that the king of Egypt, the pharaoh, was single-handedly defeating the entire Hittite army. That he killed, quote-unquote, hundreds of thousands of people on his own, and that no man in history was as great a warrior as him, and that the deeds that he did were beyond the comprehension or ability of normal men, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, for the people out there who just assume that whatever the government says is true, then they would have to accept that this is the case, when I think it's obvious to anybody who is trying to gauge reality that he's bragging, that he's the guy making the inscriptions, and he's not going to say that his role in the battle was likely negligible and probably negative. And that's actually the conclusion of most historians, is that the Pharaoh of Egypt made a series of rather large blunders, that he was deceived, he was made a fool of. In the course of the battle, he had probably no role whatsoever, and I think this is actually the conclusion of a lot of people. If you read Tolstoy especially, he thinks, once the fighting starts, it doesn't matter who the leader is, by and large. Maybe that can be debated, but there's no question that, or there's very little indication other than his boasts, that the Pharaoh of Egypt did anything like what he claimed. I think anybody looking at it would recognize that, and that's a very arcane example, but one of many that I could make, where people would look at it and say, obviously the claims of the ruling elite here are self-interested, that they're not true, that they're fibs, that they're exaggerations, and that clearly they're made in a self-interested way. But then when their government makes claims that are no less ridiculous, the idea that Obama is creating jobs or that he's keeping us safe, these are all things that aren't demonstrated. They don't stop actual terrorist attacks. They provocateur and capture people that the FBI has coaxed into accepting a bag of sugar that they think is a bomb, and then they immediately arrest them. When real terrorists actually try and do anything, they can't. They are unable to stop it. They haven't stopped any. The only things that have been stopped by ordinary citizens, and there's only been one or two of those. The underwear bomber was one, and then the Faisal Shahzad, I think was his name, the Pakistani who placed a bomb in Times Square. Neither of those were intercepted by the government. And the protection that this is just one example, but the protection it offers, by attacking other countries is dubious at best. Again, you have to just accept their pronouncements as factual and earnest and sincere, and there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to accept anybody a priori is being correct, like right all the time. It's funny how there's this. It's cliche to imagine politicians as liars. It's not. It's an empirical fact for the vast majority of them that they are. There are some people who you probably could analyze and say, well, they're maybe not lying that much, but you're talking about a tiny fraction of the people in government when you're talking about that. And yet, at the same time, when they make assertions used to justify the aggrandizement of their own power, people then accept those at face value. That is not a basis for accepting their legitimacy. That is not a good reason to have faith or think that they deserve faith in their credit. They don't deserve the adoration that people give. They're not that important. There's a lot of forces within society, and this is the trick in social sciences, is to kind of say, well, there's some government, hence government's responsible for everything, and then of course free market people can say, well, there's some free market, so free market's responsible for everything. You just have to be a little bit more sophisticated than to jump into the correlation does not equal causation fallacy, which is essentially what people are doing. Like, the government exists, the government asserts that it's helping us, hence it is. No. And in most, it's interesting because in any particular field, like if we were to look at just education or just healthcare and really look at either one, and let's approach it from a what would be the best way to address this? What is the rubric for measuring success? What is the best for the most people, say in healthcare or education? Anytime you start to try and do that, and you look at what the government does, it's very hard to see how what government actions are attempting to even try and do that. It's very clear that they're doing things politically. I mean, look at the schools. We have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. The narrative of all the textbooks is one of the growth of government, facilitating a better society, that the government is the savior, that it's a rescuer. Sometimes they'll admit mistakes, like say with the Indians, but it's always we're past that now. I think U.S. nationalism is kind of interesting in that they are willing to admit failures, but only to say we've since grown past and we no longer make those mistakes. So, yeah, racism once, no longer. They can say that even though, their policies are demonstrably racist. They kill brown people all over the world. And their domestic policies overwhelmingly disparage and hurt blacks. But then they can say, look, Martin Luther King gets a chapter in our book, so we're past that. If we look at like the New Deal, for instance, the number one determining factor in who got stimulus money, essentially government spending, emergency government spending, who got the Make Work programs, it wasn't whether those states were poor or really needed it. The states that were the poorest, by the way, that were the hardest hit by the Depression were in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, those states. But those states received almost none of the government spending. Where the government money went was swing states, states that had lots of Republicans and lots of Democrats, and that were going to be important in preceding and following elections. And so it's clearly an example of vote buying. That's an empirical fact about the New Deal that isn't really debated, but is not well known by anybody who likes to laud it as a saving of the country, when clearly it was politically motivated. Maybe he thought he was helping people, but he wasn't going to not help himself at the same time. And that's exactly what was happening. And that's exactly what's always happening. Now, not everyone in the government has identically the same interests. Obviously, you have two parties, and by and large, either one would prefer to have someone from their party be in power, if for no other reason than because there are more political perks to fall onto their lap, if that's the case. But that doesn't mean that. And so there are differences. Like, it'd be wrong to say government's not a monolith in the sense that they all have exactly the same conception of what they want. The social worker, the person in the DMV, doesn't exactly have the same end game as Barack Obama does, or Chuck Schumer, or Dianne Feinstein necessarily. But they also don't matter nearly as much either. They don't have as much control over policy. But that doesn't mean they're not self-interested. Look, they're getting a paycheck. They're going there. And that's the other thing is, let's hear them all bitch now that they're not getting paid. Well, I thought you weren't self-interested. I mean, the whole claim is, look, government needs to do it because other people are selfish and they're not going to be objective. And you have government there because they're going to do what's best for everybody without any consideration of themselves. And then as soon as they start to not get paid, they're like, boo-hoo me, I need to get paid. Well, why do you need to get paid? I thought the whole point of you existing was to provide a service that is profit-free, incentive-free, subjective-free, that's just completely, totally, a philanthropic exercise. So why do you even need a paycheck? Is that why you're doing it? And the answer is clearly yes. I mean, the lower bureaucrats, the school teachers, the cops, the military people, to a large extent, they're just in it for a paycheck that they think, and correctly, that it's a relatively stable paycheck. It's harder to get fired, especially if you're in something that has some kind of tenure position, which they don't all have, but some, like they're not they're not members of the market, so they don't have to worry about quote unquote going out of business. Even now, they can print as much money as they want. They can levy taxes as much as they want. They can't go out of business in the normal sense, which is bad, by the way. That means that they have no reason to do well or to do good. And you can say, oh, they can get unelected. You know, only the politicians can get unelected, and statistically, they don't have, but the rest of the bureaucracy can't. And the politicians have such a recidivism, and so much incumbency that it's really kind of silly to talk about those terms. It's unreality. There's several aspects, especially when we're talking about checks and balances, where people propose that, well, yes, there's a potential for abuse, but there's a safeguard, but none of the safeguards, um, in actual fact, and there's theoretical reasons why, actually function. One would be like the courts. People say, oh, the courts will make sure it's legal. They won't let there be abuses, and it's just ridiculous because the courts are paid for by the government. They're appointed by the government. They have to be politically involved, usually explicitly within a party, although not always, in order to even be in a position to gain a judgeship. To be a lawyer, to be in the bar, uh, they have to meet the bar association standards. So like the idea that they're this independent judiciary is absolutely ridiculous. And there's so many examples, like of them never declaring a law unconstitutional, a federal law, for like 60 years from the New Deal until like 1999 or something like that. And they do it every couple hundred cases. They'll rule against the government. Or the judges who will issue warrants, like there are judges who have issued warrants every time. They've never looked at a prosecutor or a grand jury and said, this is not worthy of a warrant, ever. Well, that's not a check and balance. And another one is, if the politicians have an incentive to do a good job, because if they don't, they'll become unelected, even though it is a fact that voters are ignorant of the activities, the efficacy, and the results of government policies. It's a fact. Michael Huemer does a nice example of this when he gives lectures that both the lectures I went to that he gave. He started by saying, "Who here knows who the president is?" And everybody knew. Who knows the vice president? That's actually something a lot of people don't know. I think it's something like 60-40, 50-50, even though that's a pretty important thing. Then he asks, how many of you know who your congressperson is? And at a libertarian event, it's most of the people, but I think it's something like 10% of the population knows that. And then he asks, how many of you even know what the last piece of legislation was that your representative voted on? Nobody knows that. Nobody. And I follow Justin Amash, and he posts that on his Facebook, and I still don't know that because I don't literally read every single one and mark down and then look it up myself. And he's the most transparent congressperson ever when it comes to that. And yet, so, they're passing a large volume of legislation, a large volume of regulations, all manner of activities, and almost everybody has no specific knowledge of any of it. And you're going to say that those people then are going to be able to rationally vote based on the efficacy of the policies? Absolutely not. Now, are there occasionally hot button topics and pieces of legislation that get a lot of people upset? Yeah, like Obamacare. Sure, that does happen for that one piece of legislation among thousands or whatever. But even then, how many people have read Obamacare? The Onion did a great article where it says, man who favors or understands Obamacare 8% argues with man who understands it 6%. And that would probably be a large percentage, because I don't even claim to understand it that much. It's too long. And it's written in legalese, which is not an accident, by the way. They don't have to write things in legalese. They just do that because they want it to be difficult for people to understand. They do not want... and it's not because there's some evil, like, sinister plot to, like, put satanic subliminal messages in there. It's because they don't want to be able to be second-guessed. They don't want people to be able to say, well, I don't think that makes any sense. They just want everyone to have to take their word for it. That's why. and it works because people can't, and it's not because people are too stupid. That people kind of hear this and like, well, so people are stupid, so they should be running everything. Look, the people in Congress aren't that smart either. It's just that the rest of us have other things to worry about. It's rationally ignorant. Why should you attempt? I could go and I could look at everything Justin Amash voted on, then I could go look up the legislation and I could try and read it, and I could teach myself to learn legalese, and I could go and look at the empirical evidence about the effect that it may or may not have, and if there is any even empirical evidence about it, I could look at the theoretical arguments pro and con, blah, 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 blah. You can do all that, and then I'm going to go vote, and my vote's going to count the same as the person who doesn't even know who their congressperson is. And so what is the point? I could have spent that time doing almost an infinite number of other things, probably almost all of which would have been a better use of my time. So it doesn't mean that I'm stupid or that other people are stupid. It just means there's no reason for us to bother. And they like it that way. So the idea that there's this democratic, veto that's going to hold these people accountable, it's not entirely untrue, but it's extremely dull in its effect. It doesn't have that much direct influence. And besides, they control the elections, they count the votes, they say who's even in the electorates, they determine what the electorates are. If they're an incumbent or if they're in the party, they have automatic all kinds of press and a certain amount of prestige and a platform to speak from that's denied any potential competitors. So it's a tightly controlled, rigged system. It's not 100% rigged. It's not like airtight or watertight or whatever. It's not like it's an aristocracy that's necessarily genetic, where if you're just a normal person, you can't ever enter it. There are plenty of normal people who enter politics, the vast majority of whom don't go very far, but a few of them make it, into positions of power. But the only way you can really do that is by playing along with the system or being in some extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes very famous people are able, just because of their sheer popularity, to enter politics when they're really not, without having, quote-unquote, sold their souls. So somebody like Jesse Ventura. Ron Paul wasn't really famous, but he had this thing where he had delivered so many babies that it was difficult for him to, he was able to get elected largely for that reason. That kind of stuff can happen, but it's relatively unusual. And it's hard to get very high on that, because if you're going to be honest and you're going to say what you really think, there's always going to be a lie that sounds better. If you have any kind of moral scruples whatsoever, then there's going to be political strategies that you're not going to use. So the people who rise the farthest are the most ruthless, the most sadistic, the people with the fewest scruples, and they're the most evil. And then the thing is, there's so much rational ignorance that they're able to get away with so much. The the amount of chaos, death, destruction, and loss of property that they routinely cause, and not have any reaction from the population at large, is atrocious. And they get that, they're able to do that because of this full faith and credit thing, where people just believe, hey, we need them, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And if anyone questions, their things continuing with them in absolute power, then that's the problem. The problem is people questioning their absolute right to rule, when that's what we need a lot more of. Now, not one to say, we're at the cusp of a libertarian revolution where everyone's about to embrace anarcho-capitalism. Certainly not. As nice as that would be. But there's always been some people who have questioned it. Always been a few. And the number of people has certainly grown. Now, that's not to say it went from none to million. Well, it may be in the low millions at this point. It depends how big of a circle we want to draw. So I am happy to see that development, although what it will mean in the long run is impossible really to know. But it has happened, so that's good. Stuff like this I think is good too, even though it's more entertaining than functional in what's actually happening. But if someone says don't fuck with the full faith and credit, it's kind of like, why not? Why do they deserve this kind of credit? What is it about this government that makes it so valuable that we can't even begin to question its legitimacy? And the arguments for why we shouldn't do that are so silly. I mean, they're just, well, it exists, there's some kind of degree of prosperity, hence it's responsible. And then or all these other assertions that it does this, it protects us from consumer, it protects us from rapacious companies, and it's like it's none of them are as rapacious as the IRS, and who's to say that what's most goods and services are provided a higher degree of consumer protection than what the regulatory agencies prescribe. It's kind of like the minimum wage thing. If government mandates is the only thing that's keeping wages from being rock bottom, so to speak, whatever that means, then why doesn't everybody make government mandated minimums? If evil employers, if the only thing that keeps them from paying us all a penny a day is the government telling them they have to treat workers right, then why don't we all make a minimum wage? And it would be one thing if everyone made minimum wage and there were just a couple thousand people who made more, a couple thousand exceptions, but almost most people are exceptions. Most people make more than minimum wage. The quality control in most products is higher than the government standards, like a lot higher. Your average fast food restaurant has higher standards of cleanliness and consumer safety than the regulatory apparatus of the state. And as someone who worked in food service for a long time, I can say that the regulatory apparatus of the state is pretty shit. You're talking about an inspection once or twice a year for 2 hours or some ridiculously. That does not keep a store. That does not keep a store clean. That does not keep customers not getting salmonella at all. All it does is tax them to give somebody a salary to go around doing nothing. I mean, literally doing nothing. And you can say, well, if they weren't around, people, they just let everything go. They're not keeping standards as high as they do all year for the two spot inspections they didn't see coming. It's because they know you'll just go to another restaurant if your food is shit, and people can tell. So, all these assertions of all the things they go to is none of them bear any scrutiny. All of their actions are better explained as self-interested moves, not philanthropic, altruistic, Benthamite ones. And so they don't deserve our faith, and fuck them. So that's it.